On the eve of the American invasion, Saddam Hussein's Iraq suffered little robbery and violent crime. Saddam, after all, was an authoritarian. His police, while brutal, ensured that street crime was almost unheard of. In fact, prior to the invasion, Iraq had a crime rate that was among the lowest in the entire world. That all would change practically overnight. In October of 2002, Saddam, bracing for a U.S. invasion, would empty Iraq's prisons. In what was seen as an attempt to garner support on the international stage and at home, President Saddam officially declared, quote, "All jailed prisoners, detainees, and sentenced fugitives for political reasons are granted a complete, comprehensive, and final amnesty." This ultimately amounted to many thousands of people, mostly political prisoners, but it also included thousands of common criminals, and some of Iraq's most violent, those imprisoned for murder or armed robbery. Thus it was that following the American bombing campaign, all hell broke loose. Public order had evaporated. The so-called shock and awe campaign was so overwhelming that by mid-April, the Iraqi army had ceased to exist. With criminals roaming the streets, carnage ensued. Although, amid the chaos, lines began to blur. With the breakdown of society, common people, moms and dads, became petty criminals themselves. As in the first Gulf War, the aerial campaign had once again targeted water and sewage treatment plants along with the electrical grid that powered them. As a result, even bottled water became scarce. Starvation and disease became a serious danger for the population. Naturally, looting became a form of shopping. The desperate poor, driven by hunger, and criminals, driven by greed, formed gangs that prowled the streets looking for targets. The police had drifted away from their stations to join either the vigilantes or the gangs. Crime became rampant, including homicide. But Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld chose a bare-bones approach, running the Defense Department like something of a corporation, slashing employees and using the bare minimum of troops, hoping to fill the rest via contracts awarded to defense contractors. Among the first fissures in the military was a very public feud between Rumsfeld and Army Chief of Staff General Eric Shinseki. Shinseki thought that Iraq should follow America's so-called Bosnia model, or 1 U.S. troop for every 50 Bosnians. That would amount to 300,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. But Rumsfeld scoffed and allowed less than half that amount, about 130,000 troops. During the Algerian War of Independence, the French used over 3 times that many, nearly 500,000 in all, to fight about the same number of insurgents as the U.S. would fight in Iraq. Needless to say, they lost. Among the first fissures between American forces and the Iraqis, the breakdown in security. Dr. Faik Amin Batir, who was the head of the city morgue in Baghdad, spoke about the gravity of the situation. Nobody knows when he will be killed, when he will be attacked, when he will be looted. This is the real situation. There are a lot of criminals because of the lack of security, lack of police control. You know, Iraq was controlled by many security systems. Being in control, the lack of security reflected poorly on the Americans, and was among the first and most important factors undermining their credibility. Among the myriad mistakes made in the lead-up, execution, and aftermath of the invasion, the decision itself to target Iraq, choosing the Iraqi people as a people to pacify and subdue, also proved to be unwise. Never mind the fierce national pride of a people who had kicked out the British and gained independence nearly 70 years earlier, Iraq was also historically a hardy agricultural society. Another way of putting that would be, they were heavily armed. We tell the Americans, we are prepared for them, says Abdul Amir Nasir al-Abadi. My grandfather has a gun from 1895, and I'm going to use it to kill American soldiers. I'm keeping this gun in my hand. I also have a pistol and a Russian Kalashnikov. All Iraqis have these. Indeed, Iraq was one of the most heavily armed societies in the world. And on a per capita basis, Iraq's gun ownership rivaled other clan-based societies like those of Yemen and Somalia, where virtually everyone is armed. But those corroded rifles and pistols passed down along generations were the least of the Americans' problems. Along with emptying prisons, Saddam also made life difficult for the Americans by dumping small collections of weapons and explosives among the Iraqi population, and distributed rifles. But some weapons dumps were massive, the size of small cities. There were also the Iraqi military arsenals just ripe for the picking. With the army effectively non-existent and a lack of U.S. troops to guard these depots, Iraqis began breaking into them. The result was that Iraq, which was already a heavily armed society, became overflowing with weaponry. Estimates put the number at up to 1 million metric tons. There is more ammunition in Iraq than any place I've ever been in my life, and it is all not securable. These weapons would be sold or simply passed out for free to friends and family. Now, almost every Iraqi had a Kalashnikov or other variant, and many had machine guns and RPGs. For example, the American Congress and subsequently the public would not be informed until the end of October of 2004, more than 18 months after the war began, that a cache of over 380 tons of artillery shells, plastic explosives, mortar rounds, TNT, and other powerful conventional explosives was cleaned out by looters. This storage site, which was just 30 miles from Baghdad, was left unguarded by the US military. This was certainly an error that would come to haunt them. Though Rumsfeld's DoD failed to emulate the so-called Bosnia model in sheer numbers of troops, they adopted another Bosnia-era policy which would come to uniquely define the American occupation. Known as DAB, or Driving Around Bosnia, U.S. forces would adopt patrols as a routine, daily exercise. It was thought that the presence of soldiers on the ground would bring an air of security to cities and populated areas. But these ground operations also brought troops door to door, conducting constant raids on Iraqi homes. Otherwise known as cordon and sweep operations, the cavalier and often cruel nature of these raids became another major point of contention among the Iraqis. These sweeps were indiscriminate, nabbing so-called military-age males, which included young teens and children, up to adult or even older men. These men, without any due process, were hauled off to American military prisons, including the notorious Abu Ghraib prison, the Saddam-era torture chamber, which was reopened by the Americans, who even reinstituted the old prison warden from the Saddam era. Just that alone, of course, along with the ensuing torture scandal, was yet another rage-inducing insensitivity which made many Iraqis ready to take up arms. Iraq was a socially conservative society, and placed great importance on not only national, but also personal and family dignity. Iraq's social norms of honor and privacy, especially for women and girls, was thoroughly violated by strange foreign men busting down doors and violently arresting the head of the household, the vast majority of the time without any evidence of wrongdoing whatsoever.
We would, in 2003 and early 2004, collect up huge numbers of Iraqis and put them in Abu Ghraib. The number eventually grew to over 13,000. Probably 99% of those people were guilty of absolutely nothing, but the way we treated them, the way we abused them, turned them against the effort in Iraq forever.
An independent report sanctioned by the Defense Department would conclude that they reverted to rounding up any and all suspicious-looking persons, all too often including women and children. As many as 120,000 Iraqis would be detained. John Bruns of 3rd Brigade, 1st Armored Division, 1st Battalion, took part in around 1,000 Iraqi home raids. He summarizes a typical Iraqi home raid as follows, quote, "You grab the man of the house, you rip him out of bed in front of his wife, you put him up against the wall, then you go into a room and you tear the room to shreds. So you've just humiliated this man in front of his entire family and terrorized his entire family, and you've destroyed his home. And then you go right next door and you do the same thing in 100 homes. Now, next week, 10 roadside bombs go off, and nobody can understand why." According to Colonel Thomas Hams, the Marine expert on counterinsurgency who worked for the American occupation, Many of the arrests were done with a boot on the head in front of his woman. You've created a blood debt when you do that. Perhaps the single most devastating move for the American occupation was the outright firing of roughly 500,000 Iraqi state workers at the drop of a hat. On May 16th and May 23rd, the occupation's leader, Paul Bremer III, would issue CPA Orders No. 1 and 2, respectively. CPA stands for the Coalition Provisional Authority, the name given to the American occupation. These orders were known collectively as de-Baathification and went a long way toward fueling the growing resistance. Order No. 1 fired anyone who worked in the top 3 management layers of all government ministries, state-owned industries, universities, even hospitals. These employees were deemed automatically to be senior Ba'ath Party members, and they would be banned from future employment in the Iraqi government. This was controversial even within U.S. circles. For instance, the CIA chief of station in Iraq was gravely worried that, by nightfall, you'll have driven 30,000 to 50,000 Baathists underground. And in 6 months, you'll really regret doing this. In fact, the number would be as high as 85,000 people, just fired outright. Order No. 2 fired the entire Iraqi armed forces and the Interior Ministry, which included the National Police. Together, these two orders would put out of work over 500,000 people. Marine Colonel Thomas Ham summarized the move like this: "Now you have a couple 100,000 people who are armed because they took their weapons home with them, who know how to use the weapons, who have no future, and who have a reason to be angry at you." When Bremer did that, the insurgency went crazy. May was the turning point. According to an official U.S. Army study of the war, just over a day into the invasion, on March 22nd, quote, "Expecting a positive reception, Sergeant First Class Anthony Broadhead led a hunter-killer team of 3 Bradleys and 2 M1 tanks toward the bridge where some Iraqis had assembled. As his tank approached the bridge, Broadhead waved at the Iraqis, but rather than waving back, the Iraqis responded with AK-47 fire. The fight quickly escalated as paramilitary forces engaged from pickup trucks armed with small arms, machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. The study maintains that this was a significant event since, for the first time, but not the last time, well-armed paramilitary forces, indistinguishable except for their weapons from civilians, attacked the squadron. A week later saw the first suicide bombing against coalition forces since the war began. A taxicab laden with explosives would kill 4 U.S. soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division in the city of Najaf. By midsummer, the lid on the burgeoning Iraqi resistance had blown off, and bombings became rampant and regular. The Iraqi resistance sought to target not only Americans, but also their allies and partners. August proved to be an important month. On the 7th, a bomb-filled van parked outside the embassy of Jordan. The blast threw a nearby car onto a roof. In the rubble were 17 dead. But among the most momentous and successful attacks, fighters targeted the Canal Hotel, which housed the offices of the United Nations. Driving a cement truck filled with explosive artillery shells, a suicide bomber crashed into the outer wall of the hotel, sending a shockwave so powerful that it blasted the windows of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment a half-mile away. The attack killed 23 people, including the chief UN officer in Iraq. The effects of the bombing were dramatic. The UN mission in Iraq drew its staff down from 800 international staffers to just 15. Colonel Thomas Hams described the fallout in a report for the National Defense University. Quote, "The August 19, 2003 bombing of the UN headquarters in Iraq convinced the organization that continuing to operate in Iraq would be too costly. In the following weeks, numerous other international organizations, including the IMF and the World Bank, would pull out of Iraq, which was seen as a massive victory for the resistance. That was a brilliant campaign. They hit the UN, the Red Cross, the Jordanian embassy, and the Iraqi police. And we were calling them dead-enders. Who do you think is disorganized at that point?" The Muslim holy month of Ramadan would commence at the end of October of 2003. This was the first time since the invasion that the foe turned fully on US forces. On the 26th, a mortar attack on a Baghdad police station killed Private First Class Rachel Bosveld. Then, a flurry of rockets were fired at the Rashid Hotel, which housed the CPA offices within the U.S. Green Zone. The next day, 4 police stations were bombed simultaneously throughout Baghdad, using truck bombs painted to look like police vehicles and filled with over 1,000 pounds of plastic explosive. These attacks marked the beginning of what is now known as the Ramadan Offensive, and it would bring the highest rate of American fatality since the start of the invasion. Attacks would become far more sophisticated during Ramadan, and the number of them would increase sharply. To compare, during the summer of 2003, there were roughly 15 attacks on US soldiers a day. By mid-November, that number jumped to 45 a day. And it was also at this time that Iraqis became adept at attacking aircraft. In October and November, they managed to shoot down 3 helicopters, including a Black Hawk helicopter killing 6 soldiers and a Chinook helicopter killing 16 soldiers. Helicopters now frequently had to fly back due to guerrillas firing at them. On November 15th, 2 Black Hawks collided into one another while trying to evade rifle fire, killing 17 soldiers. The Army even had to conclude that the Apache helicopter was so vulnerable to rocket and machine gun fire that it would no longer have a major role in attacks. The Iraqis were learning and adapting quickly, using what they had at their disposal, but they would kill many American soldiers through a simple device that littered many roads frequented by American Humvees and personnel carriers throughout the country. The IED, which stands for Improvised Explosive Device, is one of the key hallmarks of the war in Iraq. Its simplicity is both a symbol of the disproportionate firepower that the Americans wielded, as well as the cleverness of the Iraqi resistance to use all manner of essentially scraps of electronics and weapons to fashion devices that proved to be especially lethal to occupation forces. So lethal, in fact, that in the first year of the Iraqi guerrilla war against the Americans, 1/3 of dead US troops were killed by these low-tech and inexpensive roadside bombs. And they weren't just good at killing American soldiers, but also wounding them. 2/3 of soldiers wounded so badly that they needed to be evacuated from Iraq were hit by IEDs. Aside from the human cost, the monetary cost was staggering. In 2006, the Pentagon set up an office to deal with the threat of IEDs called the Joint IED Defeat Organization. By 2011, the yearly budget was $2.8 billion. And that's not counting the roughly $45 billion spent on mine-resistant vehicles. All to fight a bomb that cost roughly $30 to make. Indeed, IEDs were very crude. All one had to do was put a detonator on a bomb or artillery shell, and you've essentially made one. In the summer of 2003, nearly all IEDs were hardwired, meaning they were connected directly to the detonator. A fighter would have to hold the detonator, which was connected by a long wire to the explosive. In this instance, US forces were able to locate the wire, then follow it until they found the fighter on the other end and liquidated them. But then, guerrillas figured out how to detonate these devices remotely, using RC car controllers, car alarm transmitters, and especially cell phones. The people who detonated these bombs, also known as triggermen, were the frontline troops of the resistance, and the cell phone became one of the most important tools in their arsenal. IED explosions would reportedly be videotaped by attackers in order to improve their techniques and use the footage for propaganda and recruitment purposes. Though the US spent billions outfitting Humvees with armor to resist IED explosions, the Iraqis again adapted their ways and began placing IEDs in tree branches and light poles. Since armor plates were placed on doors, the blast would be downward facing in order to blow windows in, and also to hit the machine gunners poking out on top of the vehicles. "We got better armor, they started getting better ordnance," said Colonel Bob Chase of the 2nd Marine Division. Chase was commenting on an IED attack near Haditha, which killed 14 Marines with a single explosion, hitting an amphibious assault vehicle. This was at the time a new development in IED technology, called the underbelly bomb, detonated from deep inside the ground and blasting vehicles from underneath. These bombs were also massive, able to utterly destroy a Humvee or even a tank. Just 100 pounds of explosives detonated under an armored vehicle was the equivalent of a direct hit from a 6-gun artillery battery. Yet even a single 155mm artillery round containing just 18 pounds of explosives could easily destroy a tank on its own. That's just a damn difficult thing to defeat. IEDs were so effective that attacks increased steadily. In the year 2005, an IED attack occurred every 48 minutes, twice the rate of the year before. By the fall, there were 1,800 of these bombings a month. And the distribution of these IEDs was also sending another message to the occupation. Since they were so widely distributed on roads throughout the country, this could only mean that they were unreported by local Iraqis. A major blow to morale for US forces, who of course went into Iraq thinking they'd be welcomed as liberators. The violence was detrimental to the coalition early on. Along with the UN, World Bank, Oxfam, and the IMF all pulling out, other countries' militaries also found Iraq ultimately uninhabitable. Spain would leave in May 2004, then Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, the Philippines, Hungary. The next year, the Netherlands, Ukraine, also Poland, Bulgaria, and Italy, probably the 3 most important European allies in Iraq, would announce their plans to get the fuck out of Dodge. In the end, a $30 bomb was enough to kill probably half of the US war dead, and the resistance was so overwhelming against such an awesome occupying force that it should indeed be studied in insurgency and revolutionary circles for many years to come. The quagmire in Iraq was doomed from the start. American arrogance, poor planning, free market brain rot allowing for the contracting of vitally important jobs to defense contractors who literally do not give a shit about anything but their bottom line, along with other blunders, created something of a perfect storm in Iraq. Due to the hopeless corporate reliance on war profiteering, the lessons of the Iraq War are always important to ponder. It was Michael Ledeen of the American Enterprise Institute who said, quote, "Every 10 years or so, the United States needs to pick up some crappy little country and throw it against the wall, just to show the world we mean business. For those watching, maybe that country will be yours." Throughout the year 2023, the 20th anniversary of the Second Iraq War, I'll be covering stories related to the invasion. And if you want to support me and get a glimpse of behind-the-scenes action, or join my Discord server, or watch my too graphic for YouTube Abu Ghraib documentary, check the link in the description or go to patreon.com/GDFofficial to become a patron. It's a great community over there, and we'd love to have you. I also accept donations through PayPal and Cash App, and those are on the screen now. Also, those links are in the description as well.